When the P-47 Thunderbolt first appeared in European skies in 1943, German pilots couldn't believe their eyes. This aircraft was enormous, almost comically oversized compared to the sleek fighters they were used to seeing. Luftwaffe pilots mockingly called it the Jug because it looked like a milk jug with wings. They laughed at its bulky appearance and thought the Americans had sent them a flying joke. Those laughs didn't last long. Within months, this so-called joke became the most feared fighter-bomber in the European theater. The Thunderbolt would go on to destroy more enemy aircraft and ground targets than almost any other Allied fighter. By the end of the war, German pilots had learned to dread the sight of those distinctive razorback profiles diving from altitude. The plane they mocked became their executioner. Let me tell you the story of how the P-47 Thunderbolt went from being ridiculed to becoming one of the most lethal weapons of World War II. The ugly duckling. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was unlike any fighter aircraft that came before it. While other fighters were designed to be light and nimble, the Thunderbolt was built like a flying tank. It weighed over 7 tons fully loaded, making it one of the heaviest single-engine fighters ever built at that time. The heart of this beast was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, a massive radial engine that produced 2,000 horsepower. To put that in perspective, that's more power than 3 Formula One race cars combined. The engine alone weighed over a ton. But all that power came with a price. The Thunderbolt needed a huge turbo-supercharger to perform at high altitude, and that added even more weight and bulk. The result was an aircraft that looked more like a bloated barrel than a graceful fighter. When American pilots first saw the P-47, many shared the German sentiment. They had been flying nimble aircraft like the P-40 and were now being handed this enormous beast. Some pilots openly complained that they were being given a pig to fly. One pilot famously said it was like strapping yourself to a freight train and hoping it would fly. The early combat reports seemed to confirm these fears. And its first engagements over Europe in the spring of 1943, the Thunderbolt struggled in dogfights against the more agile Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s. German pilots would bait Thunderbolt pilots into turning fights at low altitude, where the P-47's weight became a deadly disadvantage. Several Thunderbolts were shot down in those early weeks. Luftwaffe intelligence officers studied the wreckage and captured aircraft with satisfaction. They concluded that this new American fighter was not a serious threat. Some German pilots joked that shooting down a Thunderbolt was easier than hitting a barn door. They would soon learn how wrong they were. The awakening. The transformation began when American pilots stopped trying to fight the Thunderbolt like it was a lightweight dogfighter and started using it the way it was designed to be used. The key was altitude. The P-47's massive turbo-supercharger was designed to excel at high altitude, above 25,000 feet. Up there, where the air was thin and other fighters gasped for oxygen, the Thunderbolt came alive. While German fighters lost performance and struggled to climb, the P-47 maintained full power. American commanders developed new tactics called boom and zoom. Thunderbolt pilots would climb high above enemy formations, sometimes to 30,000 feet or more. Then they would dive at incredible speed, make one devastating firing pass, and climb back to altitude before the enemy could react. And when I say incredible speed, I mean it. In a dive, the P-47 could exceed 500 miles per hour, faster than almost any aircraft in the sky. German fighters that tried to follow would either lose sight of the Thunderbolt or risk tearing their own aircraft apart in the attempt. The P-47 had another crucial advantage that German pilots discovered the hard way. It was phenomenally tough. The aircraft was built like a fortress. It had a massive radial engine in front that acted like armor, protecting the pilot. Behind the pilot was a thick armor plate. The fuel tanks were self-sealing. The aircraft could absorb punishment that would destroy other fighters and keep flying. Stories began to spread through Allied squadrons of Thunderbolts returning from missions with hundreds of bullet holes, missing pieces of wing, or with cylinders shot off their engines, yet still flying. One famous incident involved a P-47 that collided with a German fighter in mid-air, cutting the enemy plane in half and still making it back to base. German pilots began to realize that even when they got a good burst into a Thunderbolt, it often wasn't enough. The plane just kept coming.
The pilots who flew the P-47 developed a fierce loyalty to their aircraft. Yes, it was heavy. Yes, it was big, but it brought them home. Francis Gabreski, the top American ace in Europe, flew the P-47 exclusively and credited his 28 aerial victories to the aircraft's strengths. He said, "The P-47 was the perfect aircraft for me. It was rugged, it was powerful, and it could take damage and keep fighting." Neil Kirby won the Medal of Honor flying a P-47 in the Pacific Theater, where the Thunderbolt also served with distinction. On a single mission in October 1943, Kirby shot down 6 Japanese aircraft. In the ground attack role, pilots like Quince Brown became famous for their devastating low-level attacks. Brown flew 157 combat missions in the P-47 and was credited with destroying 15 locomotives, numerous vehicles, and several aircraft. He described the Thunderbolt as the finest fighter-bomber ever built. The aircraft even succeeded in the hands of other nations. The RAF flew Thunderbolts in Burma and the Pacific. The Free French Air Force used them. The Soviet Union received over 200 P-47s through Lend-Lease, though they preferred their own designs. Why it worked? Looking back, it's clear why the P-47 Thunderbolt succeeded where skeptics thought it would fail. First, it was designed with a clear purpose. Republic Aviation didn't try to make a dogfighter. They built an aircraft that could escort bombers at high altitude, engage enemy fighters from a position of advantage, and survive combat damage. The Thunderbolt did all of those things superbly. Second, American pilots learned to use the aircraft properly. Early losses came from trying to turn fight with German fighters. Once pilots embraced the boom and zoom tactics that played to the P-47's strengths, it became dominant. Third, the sheer ruggedness of the design paid off. Pilots knew that their aircraft could take hits and keep flying. This confidence allowed them to press attacks and take risks that pilots in frailer aircraft couldn't. Fourth, the massive radial engine provided reliability. While liquid-cooled engines could be disabled by a single hit to the cooling system, the P-47's air-cooled radial could lose several cylinders and still run. Many pilots owed their lives to that rugged engine. Finally, the Thunderbolt arrived at the right time. In 1943, the Luftwaffe was still a formidable force, but the tide was turning. The P-47, along with other advanced Allied fighters, helped tip the balance decisively in favor of the Allies. The final verdict. By war's end, the Luftwaffe wasn't laughing anymore. The aircraft they had mocked in 1943 had become one of their most feared opponents. German Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland, one of the most successful fighter pilots of the war, was asked after the war about Allied aircraft. He said the P-47 was the most dangerous opponent in the sky, not because it could outturn us, but because it was nearly impossible to escape from and nearly impossible to shoot down. That's perhaps the best summary of the Thunderbolt. It wasn't the most elegant fighter, it wasn't the most maneuverable, but it was the most effective at what it was designed to do. The P-47 flew its last combat mission in August 1945 and was retired from frontline service soon after. But its legacy lived on. The lessons learned from the Thunderbolt influenced fighter design for decades. The concept of a heavily armed, heavily armored fighter-bomber became standard. More than 15,600 P-47s were built, and today, only a handful remain airworthy. Those that do fly at air shows are crowd favorites. Their distinctive sound drawing spectators who want to hear the roar of that massive radial engine one more time. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt is a reminder that first impressions can be deceiving. The Germans laughed at the big, ugly American fighter, but that laughter turned to respect, then to fear, as the Thunderbolt proved itself to be one of the most lethal weapons of World War II. It was never the prettiest fighter in the sky, but it was one of the deadliest. And for the thousands of Allied pilots who flew it into combat and came home alive, it was the most beautiful aircraft ever built. The Luftwaffe learned too late that you should never judge an aircraft by its appearance. The jug they mocked became the hammer that helped smash the German war machine. The P-47 Thunderbolt earned its place in history not through elegance, but through sheer, brutal effectiveness. And that's a lesson that resonates far beyond aviation. Sometimes the most capable isn't the most graceful. Sometimes the winner isn't the one who looks the best. Sometimes the champion is the one who's tough enough to take a beating and still come out swinging. The P-47 Thunderbolt was that champion, and the Luftwaffe paid the price for underestimating it.
The hunters become the hunted. By the summer of 1943, the balance had shifted. Luftwaffe pilots who once laughed at the Thunderbolt were now looking over their shoulders for it. One of the most feared Thunderbolt pilots was Colonel Hub Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group. Zemke and his pilots perfected the high-altitude diving attacks and turned the 56th into one of the highest-scoring fighter units in Europe. They painted the noses of their aircraft with colorful checkered patterns, and German pilots learned to dread those markings. Another legendary pilot was Robert Johnson, who became one of America's top aces flying the P-47. On one mission in June 1943, Johnson's Thunderbolt was attacked by German ace Egon Meyer. Meyer pumped over 200 rounds of 20mm cannon shells into Johnson's aircraft. The canopy was blown away, the fuselage was littered with holes, and hydraulic fluid covered Johnson. Johnson couldn't bail out because his canopy was jammed. He thought he was finished. But the P-47 kept flying. Meyer pulled alongside expecting to see a dead pilot. Instead, Johnson waved at him. Meyer, in a show of respect, or perhaps shock, saluted and flew away rather than finishing him off. Johnson flew that destroyed Thunderbolt back to England and landed it. When the ground crew counted the damage, they found over 200 hits. The aircraft was a write-off, but Johnson walked away without a scratch.
Stories like this spread through the Luftwaffe and changed their perception completely. The Thunderbolt wasn't a joke. It was a monster. The aircraft's reputation grew even more fearsome when it was adapted for ground attack missions. This is where the P-47 truly became legendary. The ground pounder. Starting in late 1943, P-47s began carrying bombs and rockets in addition to their 850 caliber machine guns. Each wing had 4 of these heavy machine guns, giving the Thunderbolt incredible firepower. When all 8 guns fired together, they produced 100 rounds per second of armor-piercing destruction. Add in bombs and rockets, and the Thunderbolt became a flying artillery battery. The P-47 excelled at low-altitude attack missions. Its rugged construction meant it could dive through anti-aircraft fire that would shred lighter aircraft. Pilots would roll in from altitude, dive to treetop level, and unleash devastating attacks on German columns, trains, tanks, and airfields. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, when German forces launched their last major offensive, it was the Thunderbolts that helped stop them. As the weather cleared after days of fog, hundreds of P-47s took to the skies. They attacked the German armored columns mercilessly, destroying tanks, trucks, and supply lines. German soldiers began to fear clear skies because that meant the Thunderbolts would come. They called it the Jabos, short for jog bomber or fighter bomber, and the sound of a P-47's radial engine became a sound of terror. One German tank commander wrote in his diary, "The American Thunderbolts are everywhere. We cannot move in daylight. They destroy everything. Where is our Luftwaffe?" The answer was that the Luftwaffe was being destroyed, in part by those same Thunderbolts. Domination. By 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt had become the most produced American fighter aircraft, with over 15,000 built. They equipped dozens of fighter groups and flew hundreds of thousands of missions. The statistics are staggering. Thunderbolt pilots were credited with destroying over 7,000 enemy aircraft, with roughly half of those being aerial victories and the rest destroyed on the ground. But the ground attack numbers are even more impressive. P-47s destroyed approximately 6,000 armored vehicles, 68,000 trucks, 9,000 locomotives, 86,000 railroad cars, and 60,000 horse-drawn vehicles. They attacked countless bridges, buildings, and defensive positions. By the final year of the war, German forces in Western Europe could barely move during daylight hours because of the constant presence of Thunderbolts overhead. The loss rate tells its own story. Despite flying some of the most dangerous missions in the war, often at low altitude where they were vulnerable to ground fire, P-47s had one of the lowest loss rates of any Allied fighter. For every Thunderbolt lost, American pilots claimed nearly 3 enemy aircraft destroyed. The durability that German pilots once mocked became legendary. There are documented cases of P-47s returning to base with 1 or more cylinders completely blown off their radial engine. There are reports of Thunderbolts landing with several feet of wing missing. One aircraft landed with over 3,000 pounds of battle damage, and the pilot didn't even realize how badly his aircraft had been hit until he got out and saw it. German pilots developed a healthy respect and fear for the Thunderbolt. In German debriefs, pilots were instructed to avoid diving attacks on P-47s, if possible, and never to follow them down. One German ace said, "The Thunderbolt pilot who knows his aircraft is nearly impossible to shoot down. They're too fast in the dive, too tough to kill, and they have the discipline not to be drawn into turning fights." Da-na-na-na-na-na-na.